Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are here today for a deep dive into one of the most compelling investigations in this year's Singapore Biennale. So, how do we photograph the invisible? How do we document the echoes of an event like radiation that lingers long after the explosion had faded? So these are profound questions at the heart of Fiona Amundsen's powerful photographic series, Blowing in the Wind. And we are incredibly fortunate to have her here with us today. Hello. So Fiona is an acclaimed artist and a writer from New Zealand whose work confronts the complex legacy of military and nuclear histories across Asia and the Pacific. Her practice is a rigorous form of documentary witnessing. She meticulously edits declassified military archives, weaving them into her own images to create a visual listening that exposes the lasting impacts of colonial violence. This unique approach is formed by an equally unique background. I just found out Fiona is an Aikido second-degree black belt, and she draws on its core principle of harmonizing conflict directly with her camera practice. In her talk today titled Attempts to Locate and Work with a Radioactive Hot Source, Fiona will guide us through the research behind Blowing in the Wind. She'll explore the concept of latency, the delayed presence of image, of radiation, and of suppressed voices. She will focus specifically on the series exploration of Guåhan, Guam, and its ongoing struggle for compensation for exposure to downwind radiation from the US nuclear testing in Marshall Islands, inviting us to reflect on the lasting, invisible effects of military actions on people and the environment. So following her presentation, we are thrilled to have Singapore Biennale curator 𝗍𝗭𝗪𝗏. She's at the back. She will join Fiona on stage for a Q&A session later. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Fiona Amundsen.
Whenever I have one of these mics, I'm always thinking karaoke. That's what I always associate it with. So I won't break into song, I promise. Thank you for that very warm welcome, and a massive thank you to the Biennale team. It's an incredible Biennale, and I'm really honoured to be part of it. And it's been amazing to be in Singapore again. So I'm going to talk you through really how I made my work, and it was quite an involved process. But before I start, basically as an artist, all of my work in some way works with photography and film. And I kind of set myself these questions or concerns. So regardless of what I'm doing, I'm interested in how analog photography and film can be used to visualize radiation. And of course, radiation has no image, it has no smell, we can't see it, we can't feel it, we can't know when it's present. So that's quite a difficult thing to try and visualize it. And I'm also committed to transgenerational nuclear justice. So creating artworks that build a conversation around nuclear disarmament and demilitarization. And I'm also interested in how lens-based imagery can be used to witness the realities of social lives in the midst of a world still defined by military, nuclear, capitalist logic. And I think, as you will have seen, the timing of this talk is perfect with Thursday's announcement from Trump that he is about to start retesting nuclear weapons. So, although my work is addressing a historical legacy, the way it permeates into the present is extremely palpable. Just to give you a sense of what some previous projects have looked like. So like I said, I work with photography and moving image, and often they're combined together in exhibition space. Really for the last roughly 15 or so years, I've been looking at relationships between Asia-Pacific military histories and the Cold War as well. And the reason I started working in this context has a lot to do with growing up in New Zealand, where I grew up. New Zealand is a colonized country. It was colonized by the British. So my education was very Anglo-American centered and focused. So although we learned about World War II and perhaps a little bit about the Cold War, it was definitely from an American-centric or Anglo-centric position. And I have a connection to a Japanese family, and I recall one day talking with them. I can't even remember what we were talking about, but somehow I found out that that family is originally from 𝗏𝗏, and of course 𝗏𝗏 was the target for the second atomic bomb. And the only reason it wasn't bombed is because it happened to be a cloudy morning. And so the US, of course, were wanting to document the use of these new weapons, so they redirected the planes to Nagasaki. And I remember this feeling of like, wow, this family is only alive because of the fate of the weather. And then that really started me on this investigation, which I'm still on. The more I look into these histories, the more I start to understand how they affect our region, meaning Pacific and Asia. So, blowing in the wind. I started this project in 2023, but firstly I want to give some context. And the reason I'm going to give quite a lot of time to this context is because last year, really as part of this kind of ongoing project, I was in Japan for 2 months, and I met and talked with a lot of survivors of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these survivors are involved in activist work, where they're telling their stories and advocating for not only nuclear disarmament, but also for proper reparations for those who've been affected and continue to be affected by nuclear weapons. And so after meeting someone who's survived an atomic bomb, it's an incredibly humbling experience, and very upsetting as well. And I realised that, you know, as an artist, I get opportunities to speak in public quite a lot. And so since meeting these survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I decided that every speaking opportunity I had post that, I would use some of it to talk about the history and the fact that it's not a very well-known history. And so it is a little bit facts and figures, but it's important for us to spend time in this history. And particularly because the generation of survivors are coming to the ends of their lives. You know, they're in their late 80s and 90s. So as you hopefully know, this year marked the 80th anniversary since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And actually that's another thing I learnt while I was in Hiroshima, is the general rhetoric is we talk about it as a bombing, which actually sort of softens it a bit. It was a targeted attack. It was about testing new weapons and seeing just how destructive they could be. And some basic facts here. So since 1945, roughly just over 2,000 weapons, and this figure differs depending on what source you're looking at, but just over 2,000 weapons have been detonated worldwide. And the US has detonated just over half of all tests, or half of all weapons. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 was the largest US detonation at 15 megatons, with a mushroom cloud that stretched 40 kilometers wide, right? 40 kilometers, that's huge. And the Soviet Union then challenged with an even larger test that was 50 megatons. So 3,000 or just over 3,000 times more powerful than what the US dropped on Hiroshima. So we're talking about massive numbers and massive levels of destruction. And in terms of the present day, just over 12,000 warheads, with more than 9,500 considered military active or ready to be deployed. So that's what exists in the world right now. You know, we've got a number of nuclear armed states, from the US to the UK, to France, to Iran, to Israel, to Pakistan, to India, Russia, North Korea, and China. And then, of course, as I said earlier, Trump is now wanting to initiate again the testing of nuclear weapons, and he's using the geopolitical climate you know, as a rationale for why this needs to happen. So although this is deemed as a historical issue, it is very much a current and present problem. Out of those warheads, just over 2,000 are maintained on high alert. And of course, what that means is that they can be launched within minutes. So within minutes, a nuclear weapon could be launched and targeted somewhere and detonated. Excuse me, see too much karaoke. In 2024, the global spending of nuclear weapons reached 100 billion, marking an 11% increase. And of course, the US led this increase in spending. Has anybody heard of the nuclear football? Yeah, some people have. So the nuclear football is a briefcase, but obviously it's way more than a briefcase. Inside that briefcase is basically the codes and the ability for the US president, really the president of any armed nuclear state, to detonate or launch and detonate their nuclear arsenal at any moment from anywhere. So if you go and after this talk, go and look at any kind of news footage of a president or a prime minister visiting a country outside of their own, you look beside all the kind of people around them, there'll be somebody carrying a briefcase that looks like that. And the reason being is so that if needed, nuclear weapons can be detonated. Interestingly, when Obama first visited Hiroshima, I can't remember when that was, 2016 I think it was, at the end or towards the end of his presidency, he brought on with him the nuclear football, which of course is incredibly offensive for the survivors of Hiroshima. Having a US leader of state basically bringing on the ability to launch and detonate nuclear weapons. So, like I said, my work really focuses on nuclear testing in the Pacific because that is the region that I'm from. And for 50 years, there were 317 nuclear devices tested across the Pacific. And they were tested by the French, by the US, by the British. And basically, the last people to stop testing were the French, and they didn't stop until 1996, which is actually quite recent. And basically, you can see that statistic there. It says that the total yield of tests over that 50-year period equated to 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs every single day. So every single day for 50 years, there was basically a Hiroshima occurring in the Pacific region. And just to really get this point home, there are 14,576 days between the first test and the last test. So the legacies of this testing permeates the peoples, the lands, and the oceans of the Pacific. And to give you a sense of the scale of testing, you can see the 𝗏𝗏 test on your left, and the size of it being 15 megatons, and then Little Boy, which was dropped on Hiroshima, being significantly smaller. So the testing not only was frequent, it got larger and larger and larger and larger. And of course, this is what Trump is threatening, that will happen again. Have a little drink. So as I mentioned earlier, Britain, France, and the US are yet to really fully acknowledge, apologise or clean up or pay for the healthcare of those that they affected as a result of their testing. So this history very much lives in the present for those who live in and around the locations of where the bombs were tested. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference, and this woman was speaking, and she talked about the Marshall Islands, which is where the 𝗏𝗏 tests were, and she talked about the issues in the Marshall Islands belong to all of us because we cannot separate nuclear testing from colonialism. And of course, I totally agree with her. When we talk about nuclear imperialism, we're talking about colonization, and we're talking about capitalism, and we're talking about militarization. Excuse me. Now, the way that nuclear tests are represented in sort of mainstream public media is often through this kind of imagery here, the mushroom cloud. We've all seen this kind of imagery, right? Who's seen the 𝗬𝗏𝗧 film? Yeah, I've seen it too. I'm so critical of it, but that's a conversation for later. But basically, you can see even with the 𝗬𝗏𝗧 film, the promotional material used the mushroom cloud as an image. And of course, the mushroom cloud image, if we just go back to it, it's super seductive. It's like, it defies kind of logic. It's an incredible looking image. And unless you're a scientist, it's actually really difficult to understand just how destructive it is. So the thing with the mushroom cloud is basically it masks, it serves to mask what really is happening on the ground. Because of course the mushroom cloud is up in the air, whereas the issues, the effects, the impacts are happening on the ground. So the slow and invisible violence of ionizing radiation cannot compete with the spectacular detonations of mushroom clouds. As I said before, radiation has no tangible visibility. It literally defies vision. We cannot see it. We don't even know when we're in its presence. And so for me, I focus on how the physical matter of an image capturing process is able to materially witness and thereby see external events. And when I talk about the physical matter of an image capturing device, I'm talking about photographic film, and particularly analog film. So analog film, it basically has the ability to register and to therefore see ionizing radiation. As you know, nuclear weapons emit ionizing gamma rays, which are invisible to us, but not to photographic film. And so what the gamma rays do is they're highly energetic, and I kind of imagine them sort of pinging all over the atmosphere, in the waters, and for some people in their bodies. And basically they directly interact with the silver halide crystals that photographic film is made of. So the thing in film that makes it sensitive to light. Because of course, sunlight is also radiation, it's just not ionizing. And so the mushroom cloud as a phenomena, so when a bomb is detonated, basically with a bomb, the blast goes out. So it goes out like that, as opposed to conventional weapons where the blast forces down. So, ooh, that was a bit loud. So because the blast goes out, as a result, it sucks up whatever is below, directly below the point of detonation, which of course gets called the hypocenter. And I started to think about, the problem with the mushroom cloud and wanting to create a type of imagery that didn't replicate it, that didn't sort of aestheticize or dramatize nuclear weaponry. And I started to think about what was on the ground and how whatever's on the ground gets sucked up into that mushroom cloud to form the mushroom cloud. So all that smoke and debris largely has come from the ground. And then I thought about, well, what makes up our atmosphere, our everyday atmosphere, apart from soil and infrastructure like this. I thought there must be a whole lot of human skin in that mushroom cloud because, we're shedding skin all the time, right? So, if I just do this, I've shedded some skin. And so I started to think about this idea of downwind radiation and really how the radiation floats on particles, that have been sucked up into the atmosphere through the blast, and how they float down and permeate other lands, peoples, oceans, etc. And I became obsessed with dust. And I found through lots of research that dust particles had been collected as part of the nuclear testing. And then I thought, well, where can I get access to dead human skin? Because it's not really something you can buy on eBay. And boy, did I look. I contacted hospitals. I mean, obviously there's all kinds of ethical issues involved in ringing up and asking for some dead skin. And then, as Marilyn mentioned, I practice a martial art. And after every training, we sweep the floors. And it just occurred to me, I can't click with my left fingers. I was like that. Oh my gosh, all of that stuff we're sweeping up is like debris from the environment of the dojo, but it's also human skin, that's come off us as we're training. And so I started collecting the human skin, the debris, which is that image there. Now, most of that is from a black belt retreat, so it's high quality human skin there, high quality, yeah. And of course, all those black belts were like, we're now collaborators on your work. So actually, we need to list them on the rim sheet. So I collected this human skin dust because I wanted to photograph it. And my idea was I would photograph it on film. This is long before I went to Guam, by the way. I would photograph it on film, and I would then somehow radiate the film. Now, as you know, I come from Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is a famously nuclear-free country. So I'll get to how I tried to access a radioactive hot source in a moment. But basically, that bag is what collected human skin dust looks like. So then I photographed it. First, I did test on digital. And basically, I had someone help me. And I was pressing the shutter while they were like literally, dropping that bag of dust. Okay, and it went all through the studio. Really gross. We were inhaling all of that black belt dust. But basically, the image on your right is what the straight digital photograph looks like of the human skin dust. Okay, and as I mentioned, I had this idea that I wanted to radiate the film. Of course, we don't have nuclear power. Well, also, where do you get radiation from? Again, you can't just ring someone up and go, hey, can I get some ionizing radiation delivered to such and such? You just can't do it. So then I had this idea. I knew that there was a cancer research unit at the University of Auckland, and that they had what's called a hot source that they used for cancer research. I knew that they had some cobalt-60. Cobalt-60 is a key component of the development of nuclear power. So I contacted the University of Auckland, and they were like, you want to do what? And I went over, because I work at the university across the road, so that's what that means. I went over the road, and I chatted to them, and of course the technicians there, they were super excited to engage in the test I was trying to do, because for them, they would get to test how to build a lead shield to control the beam in terms of what I was trying to do with my film. So we had lots of conversations. I talked about my interests in terms of being an artist. They didn't understand what I meant. They talked about it from a scientific viewpoint. I didn't understand what they meant. But somehow we were able to work together until, because as you can imagine, there's lots of rules and regulations for working with a radioactive hot source. So we were just about good to go. And then their manager said, hang on a sec, you need to check the code of practice for unsealed radioactive materials. And so within Aotearoa, New Zealand, there is this, these guidelines, legal guidelines for how to work with a radioactive hot source. And it'll be the same with any country will have these. But as you can see, there's that big highlighted part in yellow that basically to use a radioactive hot source for art or publicity purposes was considered a restricted activity. I mean, that in and of itself is quite fascinating because it really shows the devaluing of arts and humanities discourses. Okay, so I'm like, okay, I'm back to the drawing board. I've got my dust. By then I'd photographed it on film, but I had no way to, irradiate it. Then I was really disappointed too, because it had been months getting up to that point. Then those scientists said to me, have you heard of a thing called chemiluminescence? I just want to point out I failed physics at school and maths, so I definitely had not heard of chemiluminescence. So they told me about how chemiluminescence is a process that's used to reveal our DNA chain. And it's often used to demonstrate, to image when there are issues in the DNA chain that result in illnesses and diseases. And I'm kind of thinking, well, why are you telling me this? And then they're like, because it glows in the dark. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I could use it to sort of substitute what I wanted the radioactive hot source to do. Because of course the radioactive hot source would have impacted my film, it would have fogged my film, making it white and pale. So I was like, oh, I could try working with this stuff. So I go on into the darkroom and drop it into the developer, and this is what it does. So basically, it's in the developer, and as you keep agitating it, it eventually runs out of its power and loses its luminosity, and so it becomes a black darkroom again. And I was like, okay, this will be interesting. So I developed a piece of film in the darkroom and then chucked this stuff into the tray to see what would happen. Now, as a slight anecdote, this stuff is messy to work with. And, when you're working in a darkroom, you're working in pitch black. So it's completely dark. And I had the stuff in a little dropper bottle, and I had that wrapped up in a black bag so it wouldn't, fog everything in the darkroom. And so I got it out carefully and drip, 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 and then immediately shoved it back in the shelf underneath the sink where I was working. And I'm thinking, gosh, it's still really bright in here. And then I look under, and I had spilt the entire thing, in my rush to kind of get it back in. And so I grab some tissues and I start cleaning up, and then they're glowing. And I'm glowing now too, because I've got it all over my hands. So obviously that piece of film was a disaster. But my point being is it took a long time to learn to work with it where it wouldn't just ruin everything. Oh, and basically that's what it looks like. So the flares on the piece of film that you can see, that's where the bright, glowing, yellowy green has touched the film directly and kind of burnt itself into it. So a lot of my work, particularly the work that's shown here, was made in Guam and on Tinian Island. I won't go into how I ended up in Guam and Tinian, but basically Tinian Island is the location that the planes that left to go and atomic attack Japan, they left from Tinian Island. So Tinian Island was the launch point for the use of nuclear weapons in warfare. Guam is very near Tinian Island. It's about a 25-minute flight or something. Guam is, and I use this word purposely, Guam is riddled with US military. So it's very much controlled by US military. Guam was very adversely affected by nuclear testing in the Pacific, US nuclear testing in the Pacific, from downwind radiation. Particularly a point in southern Guam, and where there are lots of documented cancers linked to exposure to ionizing radiation. And basically, Guam is involved in an ongoing fight for recognition under what's called the official downwinder status. And if they become recognized as a downwinder, they then have access to healthcare. So, basically, the US turned up in the Marshall Islands with the And actually, I was thinking about this at the opening the other night with this phrasing of pure intention. And I thought, this is actually the image I thought of, that when this particular, I've just forgotten his name, particular military leader sat down with the local community and said, hey, we want to test weapons on in your waters and on your soils because it's for the good of mankind and it will end all wars. That was probably said with some kind of pure intention. But, that phrase, good intentions, pure intentions, the second part of the phrase, which is not so much used or said, is that good intentions pave the way to hell. So I thought about this at the opening, this particular image. Leslie Groves, that's his name. But basically, Leslie Groves sat down with the local community in the Marshall Islands and said, hey, we're going to relocate you guys because we're taking over your islands so we can test these weapons for the good of all humans, and it's going to end all wars. Now, you can see from that diagram, that map, that the Marshall Islands is a very long way from Tinian Island. It's like a 7-hour flight, right? Really, really long way. But when the US tested 𝗏𝗏 and various other tests in the Marshalls, downwind radiation floated all the way to Guam and had terrible effects in terms of creating cancers, ongoing cancers. So not to freak everybody out, but basically this is the issue with nuclear testing. Not only does it make the areas where the tests are actually occurring inhabitable, it's the way that downwind radiation floats down to neighbouring countries, etc., and immerses itself in the ocean life and in the soil, and of course, whatever grows in that soil, we then end up eating it. So I've been working closely with 𝗏𝗶𝗴𝗽, who heads up the Pacific Association for Radiation Survivors. And he's been engaged in an ongoing fight to have Guam recognised under US legislation as an official downwinder. So, like I said before, so that they can be recognised and get the health care that the community needs, etc. One of the other things that the US military did, with all its testing that occurred in the Pacific, they would put up various or more various ships and other infrastructure around the place, animals as well, set off their tests and then come back and do a whole lot of scientific measuring. All of that military hardware was towed to Guam, to southern Guam, and basically decontaminated. And in particular, it was towed to a place called Cocos Lagoon, which is in southern Guam. And basically, I'm standing on the pier, so I see that little red dot on the map, I'm standing there, and that's how close Cocos Lagoon is. So basically that area, it's off limits, you can no longer travel to it. That area, a whole lot of radioactive military hardware was washed down. And as a result, my hunch was that the water, that seawater must have trace levels of radiation in it. And so, I'm in Guam at this stage. I've taken a whole lot of photographs of areas that were linked and somehow to either the downwind radiation in southern Guam or to Tinian Island and the launch of the atomic weapons. And so I had my 4x5-inch film, and I thought, well, maybe instead of using tap water or bottled water to process my film, I could use salt water. So I gathered some of that seawater, and basically I had done a test where I took 3 images that were exactly the same. The first image I processed just using standard water and chemistry, came out completely fine. The second image I used the salt water. It came out with this grey fogging on it, which indicated that there are trace levels of radiation in that water. And then the third image, I added the chemiluminescent to it. And of course, that's the result. So this work is right straight through that wall. But basically, the glowing white spots are the chemiluminescent that has impacted the film. And the kind of overall grey, kind of washed out, murky tone, that's from the radiation in the water. And so the more I started using the water, and I started experimenting with my development times, so I used really cold developer, which meant it was a very long development time, meaning that film is soaking in that radioactive seawater for longer, the more impact it had on the film. Now, one of the things I'm super interested in is that when you use analog film, so you take a photograph and the image sits in the film, waiting to be processed, right? You can't see it until it's processed. So in photographic terms, that gets called a latent image. So something sitting, waiting to be revealed. And I started to think about the role of chemiluminescence. Like chemiluminescence is a scientific process. It's used to reveal, like I said, damage in the DNA chain. And I thought about if we're exposed to ionizing radiation, in a quite subtle way, meaning we might be eating the fish or the vegetables from oceans and land that have been affected by downwind radiation, I thought about how it's not necessarily, so say I did that, it's not necessarily me that would be adversely impacted. It's my children and my children's children, etc., etc. Because I thought about the way that radiation poisoning, it sits or it holds itself in the DNA, waiting to reveal itself in later generations. So I thought about radiation as being a kind of latent image in and of itself. So that was why I became so interested in working with the chemiluminescence. So like I said, these images are next door, and these are a few extra from the series. And so my methods of working with controlled fogging and chemiluminescence are indicative of how film can function as a material witness, meaning it's the actual material of the film is what's doing the witnessing. So it witnesses the trace evidence of external events, nuclear weapons tests, and the subsequent presence of ionizing radiation in the environment. And basically, it's the way that the film's inherent composition is impacted by the water in this case and the chemiluminescence that I became so interested in. And so really sort of evidence of the nuclear is literally embedded in the film. So this work, or this body of work, also has a short film with it, or that goes with it. It goes by the same title. And basically this film, it's really a witness testimony of Robert Celestial's experiences. He has shown this film at the US Senate as part of the hearings to be recognised as a downwinder, which I love that it's been shown in that context. Unfortunately, they're still fighting for recognition. So I'll just show a little bit of that film, and then we're going to hand over for some Q&A.
At first it's disbelief, and then anger, and then trying to prove it, and then getting other people to believe what is the truth, even though the majority at one time didn't believe it, that they'll never do, right? They even said they'll never do that to us. Our own people were saying, they'll never do that to us. And I said, well, they did. Yeah, too late.
This B-36 is on its way to the target point. Steadily, monotonously, it wings its way from 𝗏𝗏𝗏 to a point in the sky over any 𝗬𝗏 atoll. For the first time since Operation Crossroads back in '46, an atomic weapon will be airdropped on our Pacific proving ground. Here, the radar operator guides the aircraft to that four-dimensional, yet imaginary spot so necessary for pinpoint accuracy. Ground zero, 1,900 feet to the north of Runnet on the Coral Shelf. Height of burst, 1,500 feet. Allowable margin of error from ground zero, less than 500 feet.
My name is 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. I was stationed in 𝗬𝗏 Atoll to clean up the nuclear waste and dump radioactive material into what is called the dome on Runnet Island.
You were stationed between 1970...
October 77 to May of 78, 77, 78.
Shoveling radioactive soil.
More than that, in it. Did I show you the picture?
Oh my
We're in the Runnet Dome. They detonated a nuclear bomb. That's the crater of the nuclear bomb. And that's us building the dome.
And you're in it.
How many people, how many of you guys there and how many are left?
Oh yeah, some would say 8,000, 6,000, I say 4,000. Out of all of us there's less than 300 of us alive today. In our group, in our group, yeah. And they're dying left to right. They all got cancer. I don't. I have other illnesses.
You've got no shirts on, you just got shorts.
Oh, you want to see even worse? Watch. After us working in the hot area, then they check us for radiation. After. We're only wearing dust masks. We didn't have equipment. Only one time we wore that equipment, and that was for a photo shoot. What we felt, we were experimental, how to move radioactive material. We were not told not to eat the fish, the lobsters, the seafood, and we ate the coconut crabs. Criminal, what they did to us to send us there to untrain and to clean up stuff and then not tell us, and then all of us get sick and die. Yeah, so. But what they did for Guam was evil. They just didn't tell us. I think it was evil to hide it and not tell and watch the people suffer for many years. That's worse than criminal. That's evil.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for sharing really detailed processes of visualizing something cannot be seen and probably impossible to be visible in the context. I was thinking about when we were, Kim, Celine here, and Duncan, when we were thinking about this work, we really can help to think about how nature being your collaborator. And I mean, as you mentioned, there are several works also in the Biennale, really thinking about how nature being part of the collaborator. However, you really point to its core by
engaging the entire processes from the wind to the water. And I can help to think about this notion of total implication, like how all of us right now are part of that processes. Of course, if we want to dive into literature, thinking about visuality, Rachel has a wonderful book thinking about how after atomic bombing, the mushroom crowd, in fact, making all of us as a target in the longer present of militarization history. The other scholar, which is less known as Rachel, has this book called Atomic Lie. That's 𝗬𝗎𝗪𝗍𝗪𝗍. He has this amazing book called Atomic Lie, The Shadow of Light. And in the book, it's a book about cinema theory. However, in the book, he also talks about atomic shadow. That literally, in one of the passage, Professor 𝗬𝗏𝗪 mentioned how Hiroshima and Nagasaki became a massive camera obscura, which literally imprints human in this massive, is like blast, and this exposure, they are till today, they are shadows of human essence on the street, and that's atomic shadow. So for our project, thinking of pure intention, fundamentally in its core, we are thinking about the idea of developmentism. The idea of developmentism, thinking about the progressiveness of our technology, and thinking about even some of the work traced back to knowledges of enlightenment. And the notion of enlightenment itself is also have to do with the light. So I wonder from your own perspective, like what does that mean to work with light? One of the elements you haven't dived further into it. And I also quite curious on, your thought processes and your own, that emotional response, making something invisible, which including trauma, attached to the whole trajectory of this total implication, making it visible. And then what does that mean for you to create an image that is not supposed to be seen?
That's quite a complex question. I guess I want to start by talking about, so what I'm working on right now is I have been photographing trees that survived the atomic attack. And these trees are in the hypocenter. So as you may be aware, within about 1 to 1.5 kilometers of the hypocenter, everything is decimated. Trees, buildings, humans. Very few things survived. But there are a series of trees that survived. And of course, interestingly, trees need light to grow. But anyway, these trees were decimated above the ground, but below the ground, their root system somehow survived. And about 2 months later, they started growing again. For me, these trees are very interesting because they know a time prior to nuclear weapons, a time during, a time after, and of course, they will outlive the human survivors. But interestingly, these trees, no matter where they are in the city, they all, as they've regrown, they all lean to the point of the blast flash. So as you said earlier, the flash was so intense that it fixed shadows, which defies logic. You can't do that, right? Photography can't do that. It needs chemicals to turn the shadows into image, right? So yeah, nuclear weapons are like a massive camera or camera obscura. But for me, I'm interested in the relationship between light and the materiality of photography, its material analog process, but really how the film can function as a type of consciousness raising of light, and particularly of atomic light. Because, radiation is a form of light. It's just we can't see it, but film can. And so of late, I've really started to think about, and this is also because of being in the presence of these trees, I've started to think about how film, and of course the camera that it goes in, has its own type of consciousness, and how can we learn to respond to that consciousness as image. So that's sort of really what I'm working with at the moment.
You were talking about your journey across Pacific, thinking about the downwind, which is Guam Island, and I can help to really also draw reference, thinking about the Bikini Island, which is also a very famous testing ground, and through the title, which I really highly encourage everyone after the talk, visit Fiona's work right next door as part of Singapore Biennale, a massive, beautiful light box, massive in terms of sonority, I would say, size as well. But I can help to pay attention to choice of words while we are writing the process of vortex and thinking about how to introduce the work to the audiences. There were lots of reference coming back to rephrasing Pacific, reconsider the geography through certain sense of indigeneity. So I also quite curious about how you are consciously reconnecting this particular community at the meantime, apart from the exploitation of being a testing ground, but also the basic right of habitats, their own land. And how does that also become part of the work itself, which really very much reflect on your title of the work?
Yeah, again, a really amazing question. I think the history of nuclear testing in the Pacific is incredibly fraught, not only because of what it is, but also in terms of how it's represented. So, as you know, I come from Aotearoa, New Zealand, famously nuclear free. The country prides its identity on the fact that it, stood up to the US in the 1980s and said, no, we won't have your nuclear-powered submarines in our harbour. And then, of course, there's the role of Greenpeace and helping to relocate people from Bikini, and Rongelap, really affected, poisoned lands. But that history, and it's a really dominant history in the kind of New Zealand identity, like my mum talks about it, right? But that history is totally whitewashed, and it's whitewashed the fact that the nuclear independent movement is an indigenous-led movement. So Palau was actually the first country to declare itself nuclear free, which was not only indigenous-led, it was led by women as well. And so I'm really interested in how, there's a lot of activism around the presence of the nuclear and that history, particularly in the Pacific. But it is its own form of recolonizing, because it doesn't center the indigenous voices. And so for me, I could only make the work I made in relationship with Bob, and on Tinian Island with this woman called 𝗬𝗪 Fleming, who leads the Tinian Women's Association, staunch activists, particularly anti-military, because of course when we talk about the nuclear, we're talking about present-day militarism, which is on the rise. So in terms of how I made my work, it's made in consultation, in collaboration, with Auntie Deb. Auntie Deb was there when every image was taken. you heard Bob's voice. You know, for me, it's about providing something that gives back to that cause in some way. And for me, those people are always how can I put it? They see the work first, but they determine if it will go out into the public, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Your response really helped me to also make association to another Bikini Island scholar, 𝗬𝗪, right? She have this famous line called, she have this famous description for the collective experiences. She say, you cannot paint the Pacific with justice with just one brush stroke. You cannot paint Pacific with just one brush stroke. And I do congratulate you and appreciate how you bring the complexity through that dramatic but serene grayscale, like, to Singapore and share the work with us. Thank you so much. I do believe everyone have quite a lot of thought and questions. I think it's a moment maybe we open on the ground and then maybe collect some questions and comments from the audiences.
Thank you. Thank you. That was extremely interesting. I mean, I'm 54, almost 55, and I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, including before Gorbachev came in. And I mean, my sense as a child, and a lot of people knew, was that sooner or later, at some point in the future, we're all going to die in a nuclear war, and that I've heard differing views on that from people my age, but I get this sense, you know, over the previous 30 years, and maybe this was changed, you know, when the war in Ukraine started and there was some discussion about the Russians using tactical nuclear weapons, that you talk to a lot of younger people and they really had a very vague idea about what nuclear weapons were and of all kinds. And is that your view? And could you comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess it depends who you talk to. So that conference that I was at a couple of years ago where I had that quote, I mean, I'm only a few years younger than you. Yeah. I know I look like I'm 30, but at that conference, it was all youth leaders. So people, you know, our age were not the majority there. And of course, all of those youth leaders are from the Pacific. They're from the areas affected. And, you know, I think the stark difference is your question about, you know, who knows about this in terms of a younger generation? Well, I think it depends on how affected you are by it. And interestingly, in Japan, there's a lot of youth activism, a lot. And yeah, it really is about who's affected, is really about who cares. And I think that's actually one of the roles that visual arts can do, is it's about a consciousness raising. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I'm not sure if I hear correctly, you mentioned about trees surviving. Could you talk anything more about things that can survive in nuclear sites? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, there's about 170 trees across Hiroshima and Nagasaki that their root system survived the initial dropping of the weapon. So they were taken out, you know, in the moment that it dropped because of the fires, etc. But because their roots are underground, they regrew about 2 months later. And of course, their DNA is impacted by the radiation, so they grow in very unusual ways. There's an organization in Hiroshima and a similar one in Nagasaki, but the Hiroshima one is who I've been working with, called Green Legacies. And they look after the trees. And basically they're propagating the seeds from the trees to keep regrowing them, to keep their life cycle going. And there's a huge project where they're sending these seeds out to other nations to plant these trees as a kind of symbol of peace. Of course, some humans within that hypocenter area survived, but very few.
I thought about those survived tree was also extremely crucial for visual art, culture, and film. For instance, the film Hiroshima Mirror Moon, there was a very famous scene. The two protagonists was literally like standing in front of the surviving tree, and it was a deliberate decision to shot in front of the surviving tree. The complexity of the departure and the betrayal of the lover between the lovers, but also the notion of the propagation of the tree and the survivalness and the continuation of storytelling of this survival agency. So I thought the tree was absolutely tremendous important symbol, thinking about this total implication moment that we are in after the first atomic bomb was dropped.
How did you first come up with the idea to explore radiation and people who are affected by it on the islands?
That's a good question. So really what got me interested was finding out that that family that I'm connected to, that they're from 𝗏𝗏 originally, and that realization, and it really was this light bulb moment of oh, you're only alive because of the fate of the weather. And so that really started my whole interest in this history. But then just reading about nuclear weapons, because of course my original work really started looking at World War II, and World War II ended with the dropping of those bombs, or the atomic attack. So that started me reading about radiation, and I'd always known that photography, analog photography, for an image to exist, you need radiation. It's just sunlight. Sunlight's not ionizing. It'll give us sunburn, which I'm a bit sunburnt, but it's not ionizing. So that really, it just sort of started from there, looking more and more into light and how photographic film responds to light, but also the role of photography in the nuclear arms race was huge. Yeah.
One more question.
Sorry, thank you for your speech. But just wondering, how radioactive was the water and thus your images? Yeah. Should we be in that room? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I didn't go swimming in that water. So when I collected it, yeah, I basically put the bottle in and then got it out as quickly as I could. But the thing with, film is a lot more sensitive than humans are. And I think it's really, I should have said that at the beginning. When I gave a talk recently in Japan, because the other thing I forgot to mention with the trees, so I photographed these trees and then I processed them in a solution made of seaweed. And the seaweed is from the Fukushima wastewater release current line. So the seaweed has tritium in it, which is radioactive. But film is more sensitive than we are. So I would have to really soak in it to be affected by it, and over a long period of time. Yeah, because it's so trace. But that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. So it's not dangerous for me when I go and visit, but for those living in southern Guam, around that area, eating the fish, they're ingesting that repeatedly over time. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say the photo is digitally scanned, and reproduced in Singapore, actually. So it's very safe for us to go in and appreciate the work. Just rest assured, just rest assured.
But
Yes.
radiation also doesn't work like that. Yeah. Because I remember when I was trying to work with the cancer unit, I was like, oh, will I be able to touch my film after it's been under that unit? And she just said to me, yeah, because she's a scientist, I'm not. She was like, radiation doesn't work like that.
Hi, thank you for an interesting talk, and I've seen your amazing installations. So I'm not so, okay, thank you for the clear explanation on the process. But I was wondering about what inspired you with the titles of the work. For example, Blowing in the Wind. You know, I mean, it's got different meaning from the song, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously there's a famous song with that title, Blowin' in the Wind. And titling work is really hard, as I'm sure titling biennales, but it's hard to title your work because you want, or I want something that sort of summarizes what I'm trying to do, but is not just a description. And so I was trying all different kinds of titles, that somehow would speak to the idea of wind, and, downwind radiation, and this idea of a downwinder. And I tried lots of different titles, and then I was just like, oh, Blowing in the Wind, it's perfect. Yes, it's got this history linked to Bob Dylan, but, Bob Dylan was a kind of activist in his younger days, and that song was developed as a protest song, around all kinds of things that were happening in the 60s, of which nuclear testing was one. And so I thought, actually, it does what I'm wanting to say perfectly. So I sort of put my concerns about it being cliched to one side. Yeah. And I thought it is beautifully poetic.
Everyone for attending the Fiona's talk, and really appreciate your presence and wonderful questions from everyone. Thank you.